Hi everyone, my name is Marta Suarez. I am the president of the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, and I want to welcome you to the session that we're having today. This session will be about spectrum sharing in millimeter waves. We are going to talk about flexible regulations and the infrastructure challenge. So it will be a very unique session. We are going to see the last updates in terms of technology. We are going to see how the millimeter wave bands are so unique and also all the potential that they have. We will also consider some of the main challenges, especially in terms of regulations. And well, we hope that you will enjoy this session. I would also like to thank our sponsors for this DSA Summit. And I would like to introduce the moderator for this panel. The moderator will be Monica Paolini from Senza Fili. And Monica has a lot of experience in this, in general in dynamic spectrum access technologies. And we have seen many activities from Senza Fili. So Monica, welcome to this session. We are really glad that you accepted to join, and also all the speakers that have accepted our invitation. So please go ahead.
Marta, well, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here because you guys have been doing so much great work in looking at how to share spectrum, how to make spectrum available more broadly and use it more efficiently. And today we're going to talk about a specific part of the spectrum, which is millimeter wave. So the technology is allowing us to use the spectrum in higher frequency more and more efficiently. And this is obviously not new spectrum, has been there forever, but it's only now that we have the technology not only to use the spectrum, but to use it in a way that is both efficient in terms of performance and in terms of cost. So what today we're going to talk about is how exactly is this going to happen? How can we use millimeter wave spectrum to meet our connectivity needs, whether they are indoors, they're outdoors, rural communities, metropolitan areas, and so we will look at different use cases. And I have a very impressive list of panelists here, and what we're going to do is that they will introduce themselves and what they do, and then we will have a conversation about the use of millimeter wave and how to share spectrum in millimeter wave. So we have today Mohammed AlAbdulqader, if I pronounce it correctly, a manager at the CITC in the spectrum team, and that's the regulator in Saudi Arabia. Then we have Jameson Dempsey, the Government Affairs Counsel at Loon, LLC, which is an alphabet company. Alan Norman, the Public Policy Director at Facebook, and Mark Reudink, the Vice President of Technology Strategy at Counsel. They will introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do. So, Mohammed, what would you like to go first?
Thank you very much, Monica, and I'm happy to be here in DSA Global Summit. This is Mohammed AlAbdulqader, the General Manager of Radio Spectrum Monitoring at CITC, the regulator in Saudi Arabia. So I have a few slides about some challenges that the regulators might face in deploying or licensing the millimeter waves. So talking about the first challenge, which is the efficient assignment challenge. I mean, talking about how much bandwidth we have in millimeter wave, the timing for release of the spectrum, is it to be licensed or not? Is it likely licensed? So we know that in the last WRC, we have multi-gigahertz that identified for IMT 2020 in 26, 38, and 47 gigahertz and more. So we think that the regulators have a challenge in licensing that spectrum to either mobile operators or the adjacent sector, which is the fixed satellite service, or maybe the other sectors, which is the hubs and others. So there is a little uncertainty in timing how much spectrum needed to be assigned for these mobile operators. Shall we assign a gigahertz? Shall we assign hundreds of megahertz? We had at CITC a public consultation a month ago, and we received many responses saying that we need that amount of spectrum and we need that. So I think it's a kind of challenge. You have a big amount of spectrum, but you need to figure out the methodology and the timing for licensing that spectrum. So next slide, please. Here I have few information about from NERA Consulting on the recent auctions for millimetric waves, which shows that there is a little competition in some countries for millimetric waves, knowing that how much bandwidth is ready now. This shows that limited propagation makes these bands may be better for sharing criteria between some radio services. So if we can go to the next slides, please. So I mean, the regulators need to figure out the licensing framework. So is it going to be a national block assignment? Is it a geographically limited license for large countries? Is it going to be unlicensed bands or likely licensed? What is the appropriate way to assign that spectrum to the spectrum users? We know that there are many radio locations in the radio regulation for different radio services, talking about mobile, fixed wireless access, talking about fixed satellite service, new identifications for hubs and some of the spectrum. I mean, there are some services that there might be needs for taking them into account. It's not only INT. There are some emerging technologies, talking about Wi-Fi, that need to be licensed. So the licensing regime is very important here. Talking about that, the penetration of the millimetric wave is very low. So you need to assign that spectrum in a way that you believe it will be used efficiently. Assigning that spectrum, I believe, for in a national basis, maybe will be difficult to measure the usage in kind of efficient use of spectrum. So maybe geographical assignment is better in some cases for some mobile operators, since they want to have certainty in deploying their networks. So about the protection criteria and coexistence with other services, we know that there are some usage for fixed satellite services in some of the bands, like 28 gigahertz. They need to be protected, and even if we want to assign that spectrum for mobile operators, they need to be protected, or from the beginning they can use in secondary basis. So what studies have been shown lately that there is a requirement for a minimum distance, and there is a need for a guard band if the distance is not available. So we have to take into account the sharing criteria between some radio services. Yes, next slide, please. Here a little bit about the deployment challenges that might some spectrum user face. So we know that the millimetric wave will not be required in deserts, or it will be required in high density area, which require some very dense networks. So we know that there might be some challenges with maybe some governments in deploying the infrastructure in the low band and mid band. What about the small cells that we think it will come in the near future? So we think that there should be a need for streamlined urban planning rules and regulatory policy for the infrastructure access. Another concern, which is the exposure to the electromagnetic field. We know that some organizations like the ICNIRP, they have their values for up to 300 gigahertz, but we have to address the concerns. We know that they're talking about 5G spectrum, it's up to C-band, now we are going to the millimetric wave. In the future, we might go to the 70 gigahertz, which is the E-band, to be assigned for fixed links and so on. So I think the regulators, they have to address the public concerns of the electromagnetic field exposure, address the public, talk to them about these concerns. Yeah, with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you. Monica, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mohammed. May I ask you quickly, what is the current situation of spectrum availability in Saudi Arabia? So like 60, the other, 5G millimeter waves, are they already available, or you're looking?
Yeah, thank you, Monica. Actually, in Saudi Arabia, we have now the C-band from 3.4 up to 3.8. It's already assigned to mobile operators to deploy 5G services. And we have also the 2.6 gigahertz. It's assigned to 2 operators. They are using 90 megahertz and 100 megahertz for 5G services. Regarding the millimetric waves, we had the public consultation before kind of 2 months. We received the responses, and we received the response from DSA about the millimetric waves and the other bands. So until now, we did not assign and we did not license any frequency in the millimetric waves for the 5G services, but in the near future, we are planning to award the 26 gigahertz for 5G in the near future.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's move on to the second introduction from Jameson Dempsey. Jameson, over to you.
All right. Hey, everyone. So first, thank you to the DSA. Thank you, Monica, and thanks everyone for joining, or those people who are watching the pre-recorded session. My name is Jameson Dempsey. I'm a government affairs counsel at Loon. I focus on telecommunications regulatory issues. And I'm going to briefly talk about Loon, how Loon works, and some of the issues related to spectrum. So first, Loon is an independent subsidiary of Alphabet and a sister company of Google. It began as a project within X, which is Google's moonshot factory, but spun out in 2018 as a separate bet. You can see some of the bets listed here on the slide, alongside other bets such as Waymo and Wing. Loon's mission is to connect people everywhere by inventing and integrating audacious technologies. Josh, if we can go to the next slide, please. But what is Loon? Loon is a network of stratospheric balloons that delivers internet access to unserved and underserved areas all around the world, and in response to disasters. We're building a new layer of connectivity between terrestrial infrastructure and satellites. Importantly, we're not an operator. Instead, we partner with operators to help them expand their networks to new customers and to new places. Next slide, please. But how does Loon work? Well, this diagram helps to explain. What Loon does is take the fundamental features of a cell tower and places them on a balloon flying at approximately 20 kilometers in the air. Our payload includes both access and backhaul antennas, and the backhaul antennas use millimeter waves that we'll talk about, and that'll be part of the later discussion. On the access spectrum side, each one of our balloons includes an LTE payload that can cover an area of 11,000 square kilometers on the ground, extending the networks of our partner mobile operators into unserved and underserved areas, and providing service directly to standard LTE handsets of our mobile network operator partners' customers. For backhaul, the balloons form a mesh of E-band links, that's 71 to 76 gigahertz and 81 to 86 gigahertz, which connects from a ground station up to the balloons and then also between the balloons using point-to-point links. Our balloons navigate, as you can see here up in the air, by leveraging powerful machine learning technology to ride wind currents at different layers of the stratosphere to stations seek around the area where we intend to serve. And when it's time for the balloons to come down, we coordinate with local authorities and teams on the ground to safely land and recover our equipment. Next slide, please. Now, working together with our M&O partners and subject to duly issued licenses from national regulatory authorities, we've served over 300,000 users on multiple continents. You can see some of the partnerships here on this slide. We've connected users in Latin America in response to natural disasters in Peru and in Puerto Rico. And we've also announced 2 partnerships, one in Kenya with Telecom Kenya and another in Mozambique with Vodacom. Next slide, please. And here's an example of our mesh in action. You can see links spanning 4,000 kilometers over 20 balloons. And today I'm here to talk about the software behind Loon's mesh network, which uses mmWaves. This is the brain of the system, and the implications of that software for the future of aerospace networks and dynamic spectrum management are tremendous. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, traditional software-defined networking can't readily route traffic through mesh networks of moving nodes, for example, HAPS or NGSO constellations. So to solve that problem, Loon developed temporospatial software-defined, its temporospatial software-defined network, or TSSDN, which is the world's first autonomous production SDN platform designed specifically for aerospace networks. What TSSDN does is leverage tons of data and models about weather and motion of the nodes and signal propagation to simultaneously optimize network routing, orchestration, and resource management. Very simply, you can think about it as predictive networking, where we take a picture of where the nodes are about to be and use that picture in order to route traffic through that network. Now, it's not only important to know where the network is at any given time so that we can route traffic through our own network, it's also important to avoid interference with other spectrum users. So Loon's temporospatial software-defined network solves this challenge by taking into consideration ITU regulations, national regulations, and existing license databases, for example, mmWave license databases, to avoid interference with incumbent links. Now, this is very important. Because it allows us to coexist with other users in the bands where we seek to operate, not only today, but also well into the future. We can use our software to ensure that we do not interfere with other users of the spectrum. Now, very importantly, this is not just an internal project. While we do use it in our network, we've also been working with other partners, for example, Telesat, to help them use TSSDN in their LEO constellation. So if we can go to the next slide, please. To conclude, I'd like to highlight 3 reasons why TSSDN is an exciting development for dynamic spectrum management and for regulators. First, this software enables efficient coexistence of both fixed, mobile, and satellite point-to-point networks, including 5G backhaul, NGSO satellites, aeronautical, and stratospheric internet platforms such as HAPS. This is really good news for mmWave bands such as E-band, where multiple operators are exploring the band for backhaul and for feeder links. Second, TSSDN builds upon important work that regulators have been doing to make spectrum licenses more flexible and transparent. Specifically, the ability of aerospace networks to effectively avoid interference depends on the accuracy of the underlying data, including information about incumbent licensees and links. And as we'll discuss later in the panel, a number of countries have already developed self-coordinated light licensing regimes for bands in the mmWave, such as E-band, which enable operators to efficiently plan their networks, register individual links, and deploy infrastructure to serve unserved and underserved areas all around the world. Now, as regulators continue to adopt light licensing regimes for mmWave bands, it will enable more efficient use of spectrum and deployment of aerospace networks to close the digital divide. Third and finally, software like TSSDN shines a light on a future path for dynamic licensing of backhaul networks. TSSDN demonstrates that efficient orchestration of heterogeneous networks is possible with the right data and the right software. And this is really exciting for regulators looking to maximize the use of mmWave spectrum, such as E-band. So by working together, we hope that industry and regulators will take the opportunity to make this future a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Jameson, before we go on, a quick question for you. With your software, you said that you can manage interference. Does it mean that you have basically, is this basically spectrum sharing or just using database data?
So currently the way,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the way that the software was developed was for our own network, but it also works for other aerospace networks. And so what we can do today is take information about existing geostationary satellites, for example, incumbent E-band links, for example, using the ComSearch database in the United States or similar databases elsewhere. And then we can plug that into our system to ensure that we don't interfere with any existing links within the band. The same would go for radio astronomy installations and other incumbent users. So that's the way it works now, but it could be used, yeah, in the future for orchestration of multiple networks.
Yeah, because like, you know, for the CBRS and US, you have a whole network that is just used for the sensing, which seems a little bit more than you need. Anyway, I'm not going to get into there. And let's move on to Alan Norman from Facebook. Alan, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Monica. Thank you, Martha. Dynamic Spectrum Alliance. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk about coexistence in the 60 gigahertz band. If you could go to the next slide, please. 60 gigahertz, very high, extremely high frequency, has a unique value proposition in use cases. There is 14 gigahertz of spectrum, so it enables super high throughput, high capacity, low latency, and high resolution type applications. And at this very small wavelength, you get, you can have a very small footprint with your antenna array and very narrow beams that give you fine spatial resolution. There are two use cases that are broadly in the band. One is communication, the other is sensing and radar. Next slide, please. And it's been enabled over the last 20 years by some significant advances in technology. So one is all the ability to miniaturize and put everything on CMOS. The second is the ability to actually do phase arrays dynamically. And so these are, you know, potentially 90 element arrays. There's a huge amount of network processing that happens to process these arrays. And so that was another requirement. And finally, the ability to have radios which are really wideband to handle these large channel bandwidths. And that's really come into fruition only in the last 5 or 6 years. Next slide, please. So one use case is augmented and virtual reality. This requires low latency. It's super high throughput, massive data exchange. And one of the requirements is when you're moving around, if there's any kind of latency or delay, people feel a motion sickness equivalent. So it's really important to get a 99% packet latency within a few milliseconds. Next slide. Another use case, completely different, is using this band for wireless backhaul. So here is an IEEE 802.11ay document that shows a mesh network of how you can use 60 gigahertz and take advantage of the fact that you have very poor propagation and limited interference, so you can deploy a network very densely and deliver, you know, fiber-like capacity wirelessly. Next slide. And a completely different use case is sensing and radar. So in this case, you can do things like proximity detection, gesture recognition, presence detection, robots for 3D vision, liveness recognition. So my point here is, here you have a single band that has very different use cases. And the question is, how does coexistence work? So next slide. So there are really two levels of coexistence that are happening. One is for mobile applications, might be a laptop, it might be an AR/VR headset. We're really using listen before talk. For the fixed networks, listen before talk is not at all effective because you have a very narrow beam and the different devices don't see each other. So the critical things are beam steering and transmit power control. And then for radar, which I don't actually call out on a slide here, it's really about duty cycle and limiting the transmit and on and off times. Next slide. There was a lot of work to get these rules in place. CEPT or ECC report 288 describes a lot of the work that was done here, looking at all these different sharing mechanisms. And this was done because, and next slide, the original CEPT rules, and these were often adopted elsewhere, and you can't see any of it. But my point is, fixed outdoor networks were not allowed. And there was a completely separate regulation for radars. And so it was through the work at SRDMG in CEPT, as well as the work at ETSI, we were able to come up with a new set of rules, which were just announced last year. Next slide. And here what happened was 3 use cases were defined. One was the mobile use case that I described. Another was a low power that could either be mobile or fixed outdoor. And then another third one in anticipation of higher power applications. For example, might be cellular backhaul. And it might actually be for a 5G network, again, but with an unlicensed band, to be clear, were outlined. Next slide. And so that was put in place last year. And now the task at hand is to create the harmonized standards that all these systems can work with. And so, as I mentioned, the first example, which is the mobile use case, uses listen before talk. The fixed network equipment, that's strictly fixed, so fixed point-to-point networks and point-to-multipoint and mesh use transmit power control. And then new IMT-based applications, which might be a fixed network but serving mobile devices. In this case, is also looking at transmit power control. And so that's under development. And so here's an example where, depending on the use case, depending on the scenario, different sharing mechanisms were put in place, and completely different than what might have happened at lower frequency, where you might have considered exclusive licensing or light licensing, are strictly just license exempt, but not something where you had this hybrid model. So thank you very much. Appreciate your interest in the topic.
Alan, thanks. A quick question before we move on. The radar and sensing, would that be done using the same network that you use for communications? Like, for instance, some they're now developing, they're using Wi-Fi, your standard home Wi-Fi network for sensing, or it would be a different infrastructure?
So this sensing is not the sensing for detecting interference. The sensing I'm talking about are things like gesture recognition or child left behind in your car is another example. And so they're typically 2 ways that's done. One is the WiGig chipsets based on 802.11 AD and AY. They have a sensing capability built into them. The other is their dedicated sensing chips using FMCW radar that will do scanning. And so these are the advantage of this very large amount of spectrum is that you can get very fine resolution in your sensing. So the granularity is there. The challenge, of course, is how do you get all these applications to work together? Fortunately, at 60 gigahertz, if there's any kind of spatial separation, it's not an issue because the propagation is so limited. The challenge is if you have a phone, for example, where you might have a sensing device in it, and you're also communicating between maybe my laptop and my glasses using AR/VR, how do those 2 coexist? And so those are some of the things that industry is working out.
Yeah, but I guess actually that is going to be the same, because yeah, in Wi-Fi they're using it for motion detection, not just for interference.
I'm sorry, correct.
Yeah, I guess it's part of the same work, the same standardization work. Okay, perfect.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to Mark Reudink, Crown Castle. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you to the DSA for hosting this global summit. My name is Mark Reudink, and I'm the Vice President of Technology Strategy at Counsel. Counsel is a shared communications infrastructure company with all of our assets based in the United States. My responsibilities are for defining different business initiatives, evaluating emerging technologies, and being able to leverage Castle's assets of 40,000 towers, 75,000 small cells, and 80,000 miles of dense metro fiber to bring new technologies to market. We use the mmWave technology both for our own use, and we deploy it on behalf of our carrier customers as well. So we've seen 5G deployments for a variety of different use cases, being that through fixed wireless access and also within stadiums for those high density, high capacity needs that we see. And also traditionally we have the mmWaves being deployed for cell site backhaul and also as redundant links for enterprise backhaul as well. I'm looking forward to the discussion with the rest of the panelists this afternoon or this evening, whichever part of the world that you happen to be in as you're watching the show. Back to you, Monica.
Thanks, Mark. And I guess we can all come together now and start a conversation. But before we actually do the, Mark, I have a question for you. Can you tell us about the use cases that you're seeing? Because, you know, Crown Castle, you're kind of, you're not a mobile operator, you're sort of, you're working with them, but you have a much broader scope. What kind of use cases do you see?
Yeah, so we've seen several different use cases, and I think traditionally, as I mentioned, certainly the backhaul for cell sites and also small cells are one of the initial use cases that we're seeing that's been traditionally around. Now, as we move into 5G, that leverages multiple frequency bands and they complement each other depending upon those use cases. Within stadiums, they're very high bandwidth. For example, near instantaneous video replay, more fan interaction. Of course, that started off back before COVID, but now we'll start to see more of that again as fans return to the stadiums. So those are the type of applications. Then we move into some of the things that Alan was talking about with low latency applications that then require not only the high bandwidth connectivity, but in many cases edge compute as well, that lend themselves to augmented reality and virtual reality applications as well, both in stadiums, enterprises, and then we'll see that in the outdoor side too.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, now that you talk about stadium, and actually, can you all guys come on video so we can discuss? I remember a few years ago now, and we were talking about using mmWave in stadiums, and people were just laughing at it as if it was like the most, you know, outlandish idea. You know, you're just gonna have what? How much of a density? And it's quite amazing how in a few years, you know, mmWave used to be something you didn't know what to do with, and now it's really like it's becoming really hot property, or hot shared spectrum. So let's talk about it. So there is clearly the sense in which mobile operators are deploying and using it, but who else is going to be the major user of the spectrum? So, you know, with Loon we have sort of like Loon is a sort of a service provider to operators, but who else is who's going to spend the money, who has the money to and use the spectrum or deploy the networks for using it? Anybody wants to?
Yeah, if you allow, Monica. Yeah. So I think there are multiple users who want to use the millimetric waves. I mean, who want to deploy, I mean, the Wi-Fi, the fixed satellite servicing, the 28 gigahertz and above, and the E-band. Also, there are users who need to, let's say, the private networks. Now, we are not talking about 5G to consumers. We are talking about private companies who want to have spectrum for 5G to deploy their own network. There are some deployments for millimetric waves for these users. Also, there are, I remember in the last WRC, there are some identification for hubs services in the 47 gigahertz. And I think there are some efforts by some companies, I mean, SoftBank, maybe Loon, others to use this band and others for hub services. So there are multiple adjacent, I mean, sectors who want to use the high capacity bands to deploy their services here. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Anybody else wants to comment on this?
I think talking through the 60 gigahertz band, we're seeing some deployments currently for Wi-Fi networks in dense metro areas where it may not be cost effective to bring fiber to each one of those locations on streetlights, etc. And to be able to use the 60 gigahertz mesh backhaul, especially due to the small form factor of those links, is a very attractive solution. So we're seeing a variety of different use cases for millimeter wave bands.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, within the E-band, and there's an ongoing proceeding right now, and so I think many of the players have submitted their comments and have described what they want to do. But you can break it, I think, into two different buckets. One bucket is urban 5G backhaul, and a number of the mobile network operators have expressed their interest in that. And then there are lots of digital divide related use cases, and most of those are for feeder links. So whether that's services like Loon or the fixed satellite service, a number of NGSO LEO constellations are looking at E-band for backhaul. So that's how I would divide it, as kind of the urban and then the rural. And of course there are also the fixed wireless folks who are looking at it as well.
Yeah, so if you think about how do you divide it, because there are so many use cases and some are in the same basically place, right? So you just use it like whether it's indoor, outdoor, backhaul access. So how can you split? How can you share the spectrum? So it's not just among entities, it's among different parts of the world, different parts of our environment. How do you do that? And Jameson, there is an interesting case with the E-band, right? In terms of how do you split it?
Sure. Yeah, with the case of the E-band, a lot of it comes down to physical separation. The E-band has long been recognized for its unique propagation characteristics. The FCC calls them pencil beam links. And in essence, so long as you have physical separation, which could be a matter of meters or kilometers, and you have no bore site alignment, that means that the two links aren't lined up directly, the risk of interference is very low. And ComSearch, which runs the E-band database, has submitted a study in the record saying that the risk of interference between existing fixed point-to-point links on the ground and a number of aeronautical use cases or maritime use cases, the risk of interference is very, very low for these. And so really it comes down to traditional frequency planning and network planning. But then beyond that, you can imagine even denser networks of moving nodes in space that do something maybe a little bit more dynamic.
Absolutely. So you just split the area, but when you have satellites that are in space and others that are on the ground, how do you do that?
It comes down to the same thing. So long as the ground stations are separate and there's no bore site alignment, the risk of interference is very low. We have an engineer on our team who says you really need to try to get E-band links to interfere with one another. And so long as you use, I think, traditional frequency planning techniques and you're a good spectrum steward, the risk of interference is low, which provides so many opportunities for all of these new use cases to coexist. So whether that's 5G backhaul or fixed satellite services or services such as Loon that use stratospheric internet platforms. And one thing that I really like about this, just to add an addendum, is that with the fixed satellite service and with services such as Loon, we're seeking to provide service in rural and remote areas that often have no access. And now we're talking about competition for users in rural and remote areas, which is really, really interesting and I think really exciting, particularly for those people who've been left on the wrong side of the digital divide for too long.
Absolutely. But we were talking before about having the sort of 3D type of allocation of spectrum where you don't, typically you have a link, so it's from point A to point B in a two-dimensional space, but you can go beyond the 2D space, right?
Yes. Yeah, so the concept, and the FCC coined this term of 3D spectrum management, at least as far as I know. They coined the term 3D spectrum management. But the idea is this: with a traditional point-to-point link on the ground, you have point A and point B, just as you mentioned. If you're talking about an aerospace link, for example, in the E-band proceeding at the FCC, it started with a company that wants to provide connectivity to airplanes. And what they proposed, and it's actually similar to the way that Loon thinks about it as well, is you have one ground station, and then you have a service area on top. So you imagine there's a point A on the ground, and then you have an elevation angle, and you have an azimuth range. And you define that 3D area within your traditional database. And you can use that non-exclusively as a way of doing coordination between various links. And once again, so long as there isn't bore-side alignment and there's physical separation on the ground, those links won't interfere with one another. So that's the idea of 3D spectrum management, is using not just lines, but also using, for example, cones emanating from a ground station as well, but still within this construct of light licensing, still within the construct of a database. So it's really an evolution of the things that are already in place in many jurisdictions, but which enables so much additional innovation and new types of networks to coexist within those millimeter wave bands.
Absolutely. Mohammed, are you guys looking into something like this as well? Or is it mostly trying to do, like, you know, power, like for indoor use and outdoor use? When it comes to sharing regimes, what is it you're looking at?
Actually, as a regulator, I mean, it's a matter of licensing that spectrum. So are you going to license the spectrum for single user in geographical area or the national basis, or you are going to let that spectrum use, I mean, the light licensing regime, or you're going to make it a license for many sectors. So, I mean, it's a kind of, as Jameson said, that it's kind of network planning. I mean, once you license that spectrum, for example, for user A, he's going to use it, I mean, either indoor or outdoor based on his, I mean, network planning system. So, I mean, there are current assignments for example, some mobile operators, they use the same band, I mean, either indoor or outdoor. So it's maybe about the sharing between, I mean, the radio services themselves. So either you will coexist, for example, between the satellite earth station with the 5G base station, or it's kind of like the sharing regime between the fixed, I mean, link-to-link, point-to-point microwave with the satellite earth station, for example. Is it going to be, there is a need for a separation distance? There are some studies presented by the ITU, and I think there are some studies currently about the, I mean, the sharing criteria between those services. Is it, you should be, for example, 4 kilometers far away from the satellite earth station? So it depends, I mean, on, for example, the 28 gigahertz. I mean, I know the satellite operators, they are maybe more, there are more demand in that spectrum. So you know, there are amount of bandwidth that people maybe doubt that it will be utilized more efficiently for a specific radio service. So I think regulators, they have to introduce some, I mean, an innovative licensing regime. I mean, kind of licensing this band for a specific user and make it maybe secondary in without claiming any protection for some terrestrial users. So I mean, with the millimetric wave, it's, I mean, a new era that comes. I mean, it's different than the mid band and the low band that penetrate for hundreds of kilometers maybe. So I mean, it's a new era that we should be careful in licensing that spectrum. And I believe that the regulators themselves, they shouldn't, I mean, if they are gonna license some bands, I think they shouldn't give it for too long. I mean, you don't know what will happen in the future. There are a lot of emerging technologies that they are coming. We know that some users, they want to have that spectrum for, say, 15 years, but I mean, you have to see the opportunity of this scarce resource, how to utilize it efficiently from the regulator point of view. So I mean, it's a major challenge for utilizing that band. Yeah, Monica.
Yeah, I think Mark, you wanted to say something?
I can see Alan raising his hand, so Alan, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Mark and Monica. I just want to add exactly to Mohammed's point about something that's new, is when you think about doing mesh in mmWave, it's not a point-to-point link, and if it's a fixed mesh network, it's neither mobile. And now if you said, well, in the mesh, oh, I'll just register this mesh, each one of these links. It's way too many links to actually practically keep track of. I mean, you could with a software system like Jameson described, but the traditional coordination mechanisms aren't practical. So you really need to think about it in a different way and either have an automated software system where people do coordinate, or come up with a different concept, for example, like node-based registration as opposed to link-based. And the reason is, it's exactly what Jameson said, it's aligning the bore site and allowing, rather the software will do the beam steering to select different routes depending on what the propagation is, if there's an obstruction in the way or things like that. And it's those kind of conversations where we try to introduce the technology wants to accomplish this and it doesn't fit the current framework, and then it becomes an important, it's why events like this are important, where we can start to exchange ideas, get people to understand what works and doesn't work. But in dense urban and, for example, on Crown Castle infrastructure, I have to imagine, that mesh use case, we think we can make it work in unlicensed spectrum or license exempt. But as soon as you get into light license, it becomes a very complicated discussion.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Your reference to the dense networks that we deploy in areas like Manhattan or downtown Chicago, when we see for your traditional 4G deployments on, it's approximately every other block. And then when you want to densify for 5G or mmWave mobility, that's multiple nodes that are being deployed, some with fiber, some with mmWave backhaul. So the coordination of all that spectrum and where it's being utilized is not a trivial task. And to be able to have standardization, as you mentioned, Alan, will be critically important as we look to scale this.
My one hope, if I may add, is that we don't just license the spectrum exclusively, because given that it's pencil beams, it becomes extremely underutilized at that point. There's really a lot more potential for more efficient use of the band.
Yeah, adding to what Alan said right there, I think that was one of the key insights that the FCC made back in 2003 when it set up the light licensing framework. Relying on self-coordination, relying on third-party database managers, recognizing that the risk of interference was so low that you could use software, you could use databases to do that. And I think that as more technologies move into mmWave, that those same lessons can be applied in different bands and in different contexts.
Yeah, if you allow me to add to Jameson. So, I mean, maybe some regulators, they're looking for revenue, so they're going to license some bands, for specific, by operators or some other users who want to utilize that spectrum. But I agree with what Alan and Jameson said, that, when you go up to the E-band, it's going to be penetrate, for meters, and maybe if you can aggregate it with lower bands like 15 gigahertz, it will penetrate for a kilometer. But having a database, having a sharing criteria, lightly licensing these bands, I think it will enhance the efficient utilization of that spectrum, more than getting just revenues of that bands. There are maybe some obvious bands in the millimetric wave that could be licensed in geographical area, not in national basis. Some, like for example, the 26 gigahertz. It's clear that, and maybe there are some agreements between some sectors, and that's what we saw from people who respond to our public consultation, different satellite operators, different vendors and mobile operators, that they showed that that band should be available for the mobile, for 5G services. So, but I think we should be careful to license this band. For example, some cities, dense areas, it will not be utilized in villages, maybe, and some, I don't know, areas that people, they're not exist, that much. So I think having a duration of licensing this band that is short will help. Going up to the 47 E-band, I think lightly licensing this band, or I don't know, assigning this band, for example, if there is a need for backhauling in link by link basis, it will be more appropriate than block assignment in a national basis. Yeah.
From listening to you, what becomes obvious, I think, is that we need more than, there is no a winning regime. And in fact, you need them all to meet the different use cases. So unlicensed and 60 gigahertz makes sense, but if everything were unlicensed, it wouldn't. So you need to have, or the lightly licensing or the licensed. So it seems like you just need to have different approaches to different bands, but at the same time, we do need to have it harmonized so that you don't have, so Loon can operate worldwide, or, so you don't have every time you go to a different country to change it. Do you think that that's a reasonable expectations that we can have, or is every country is going to go its own separate way in terms of the licensing regime?
Yeah, if you allow me to answer that question, I mean, a little. So I know that there are some users, they need certainty about using some bands for a duration because they will put some investments in utilizing these bands. So, but I mean, you have to ensure the efficiency of assigning these spectrum. So maybe, I mean, it's too early to decide. I mean, people are hurrying to license that spectrum, I mean, from above 26 gigahertz up to 100 gigahertz. They are in a hurry to, what shall we use that spectrum for? I mean, I think we should wait. I mean, kind of in the future, 5 years, I don't see that there will be high penetration in the millimeter wave. So, I mean, emerging technologies are coming. What Alan said about the virtual reality in the 60 gigahertz using license bands, other needs for E-band, other emerging technologies are coming. So the time is more important here to decide, not to hurry in licensing or deciding that this is a license or likely license. But I mean, based on the demand that come year by year, I think some regulators they will reach some decision in how to assign that spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could offer, oh, sorry, Monica, if you were going ahead.
Go ahead.
So I ultimately expect different regulators to approach it differently because that's the way that it's always been. But I think that there are common steps that regulators can take within millimeter wave bands in order to facilitate more coexistence. So one might be, for example, taking a spectrum audit, seeing what links are already out there, seeing if links have been registered that no longer exist. The next might be creating a database. If you have paper applications and you're keeping them in PDF in some sort of system, put them into a database that providers can use in order to better network plan and understand what's out there. Once you have a database in place, then it opens up more possibilities, for example, for things like light licensing or even dynamic allocation of these bands. But I think it really starts with the data and knowing what's where within these bands, and then progressing through traditional digital transformation of government towards something that can be workable in a more light and dynamic way.
Absolutely, and I think that when you think about it, if that data were available, what we would find out is that millimeter wave spectrum is highly underutilized. I mean, we know that, but we would have even a better sense, and then there would be a question of how to convince the incumbent users to share the spectrum. And what do you think is the best way to go about it? Because we do have the technology, but at the same time, if you are the incumbent spectrum holder, you're going to try to resist it as much as possible to avoid any risk of any potential problem. Because clearly, sharing spectrum is a burden on them to some extent. So what's the best way to go about it?
Yeah, if you allow me here, I mean, maybe there are some bands that they are utilized right now. I mean, the millimeter wave for example, and it's different from country to another country. Talking about Saudi Arabia, for example, we have the 38 gigahertz that's heavily utilized for microwave, and we know that it's identified for INT, and for example, the United States, they are licensing this band, if I remember correctly, for 5G services for mobile service. So, I mean, it's a kind maybe of sharing the needs. For example, if it's mobile operators who are utilizing that spectrum. So it's a matter of making the availability of that band for them to deploy 5G services. Talking about some private maybe networks, putting some, how can I say, steps that to serve them in that band, building networks to satisfy their needs in order to coexist and share with them. Doing some, I mean, monitoring stuff, monitoring the utilization of the band. I mean, putting some regulations that ensure the efficient use of spectrum. If you are not utilizing that spectrum efficiently, you are gonna, I mean, it will be taken from you from a set regulator, or it's going to be shared in some areas with other users. There are, I think, maybe money-wise, maybe other operators can, if they need that band to be utilized for 5G service, for example, they can, I mean, invest and put money to convince some incumbent, kind of leasing that spectrum. Other, I mean, innovative regimes could help. I mean, people not, I mean, do not refuse money in order to lease or something like this. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, if I may add, in the 60 gigahertz band, our experience is not so much about incumbent users, because typically the band is very lightly used or fallow. There might be some space applications. The issue is much more about broadband policy and competition. And so you have different stakeholders, whether it's the mobile operator community, you know, IMP based, or it's the unlicensed community. And, you know, if you will, fighting over something. And to me, it's unfortunate, because in fact, both groups could very much use the band. And it shouldn't be fighting about preventing others to use it, but rather finding ways for everyone to use it. And so that becomes, but it's a very, you know, that's a very active debate that's going on in many countries. I think a good example, all you have to do is read the newspapers in India about the E band and the V band, and you'll see exactly what's going on along those lines, for example.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, we have, you know, Wi-Fi and 5 gigahertz and 2.4. It's an excellent example where you can actually share, and it's more difficult to share in 2.4 and 5 than 60 because of the propagation characteristic and by just the sheer amount of spectrum. So, you know, we know how to do it. And I guess there are different actually, how do you see the use of 5G NRU in the 60 gigahertz? There is no hardware, but they're working on it, right?
Yes, and so that was actually in my introductory remarks. That was the third use case that we're working at ETSI. And I expect that there'll be a standard in place, and there will be the ability for people to understand what the sharing mechanisms, and there'll be some form of power control, because that's the most effective one. Listen before talk isn't really helpful when you have these pencil beams, and everyone expects that it will work. And then the real question won't be about you know, what is the sharing mechanism and what the technology is, but it's what the underlying costs and economics are and what will prevail. And even though, you know, often Wi-Fi is not the best technology, it works well enough, and it's so much lower cost that it becomes widely adopted. And so it'll be very interesting to see here, you know, exactly that kind of trade-off and how that works.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting because there is no advantage. I mean, in 5 gigahertz, you have the huge install base of Wi-Fi, so it starts from a advantage position. In 60 gigahertz, you sort of have an open field.
And I think
Yeah.
when we start to look at both the 60 gigahertz and then also the CBRS band in the US, the 3.5 that has a sharing mechanism moving to 5G, that's when we talk about the complementary use cases of multiple frequency bands to solve whatever problem that you're trying to address, be it indoor type of applications, outdoor applications, and if you have it all in that 5G platform, that enables you to scale and become more cost effective, more widely adopted on a worldwide basis. Sorry, Alan, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that was perfect. I actually think at 60 gigahertz for fixed infrastructure, it's not going to be about spectrum. It'll be about access to where you can install your base stations.
Yeah. Well,
The
yeah,
market is in a very interesting spot right now.
Going to be a real estate issue rather than spectrum, which I think is going to be interesting to see. Now, I wanted to just shift a little bit the topic of discussion to fiber. It used to be, again, that until recently, that whenever we talk about millimeter wave, we say, well, you need millimeter wave when you have fiber, when you talk about backhaul. And I wonder whether you think that that's really, is that relevant, or is the sharing of the spectrum, ability to use it in a more efficient way with better technology, cheapest infrastructure, cheaper equipment, that is going to change the way we look at the fiber versus wireless infrastructure?
I really see fiber and wireless infrastructure as being complementary rather than competitive, because at the end of the day, you'll always need a fiber connection back into the core of the network. But there will be instances where it's either difficult or very expensive, or the time to be able to deploy fiber will be unacceptable. So to be able to utilize and deploy wireless links, either for a temporary solution or a more permanent solution, especially when you move into a distributed core network for 5G and you look at that resiliency and redundancy, all of those will lend itself to having that combination of fiber and also millimeter wave access for that high-speed backhaul. And we're seeing a lot of natural disasters in the US, between the fires in the West, and now Colorado, and hurricanes, to be able to quickly turn up a network using a combination of all these technologies. That's a huge speed to getting people back in communications and public safety aspects of that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and yeah, I guess you're right. It's like it's really the ability to put them together and use them wherever you need, and that's a great advantage moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It's all going to end in a wire somewhere. Loon's whole use case, the mobile network expansion use case, is designed to solve exactly that problem where it's too expensive to deploy the fiber. But ultimately, the ground station is installed where there is fiber. And that enables us to connect hundreds or thousands of kilometers away to areas where it's either too expensive or too topographically difficult to install a ground-based network. And that's really what we're trying to solve. Ultimately, though, the fiber is going to need to be extended out there for resilient service. I think it's still going to be a critical part of the network.
Yeah. The question is where do you break the wireless versus wireline or fiber? And that really, it's not a question of how fiber is expensive. In some cases, it's not even a question of price. It's just not the best solution.
The only thing I would add, Monica, is it's not just where, but when.
When, yes.
That's actually one of the points, is that you have to think about wireless and wireline over a temporal perspective. You may start out wireless, then over time, as you have more customers and a denser deployment model, you may then be able to justify the investment of actually going into the ground or fiber or whatever. So, and both are important.
Yeah, and I think it's an opportunistic decision rather than, sometimes it becomes like almost a religious kind of like, are you in favor of wireless or fiber? And it really shouldn't be. It should be like whatever works better at that point, as I say, in that place. You go for that. Now, millimeter wave extends way beyond 80. So we talk about 26, 60 E-band, but there is some some work in moving beyond that 90 gigahertz, 100 and more, and both US and UK are starting to, see how to use it. What's your view on that? That clean spectrum? What can we do with it?
Well, I think there's some really exciting use cases. So we're working with universities such as NYU, and they're looking at the super local type of applications, because the higher you go up in frequency, the more precise you can be within your location. Sensing applications like Alan spoke of as well. So there are a number of different use cases. The technology will evolve. As you mentioned, it's a relatively clean spectrum, but I think it's still important to have interagency coordination to make sure that there's no utilization of the band that people are not aware of before we then open it up to additional use cases. But it's exciting to be able to look at the amount of spectrum that's available there, the number of use cases that go beyond just communications.
Absolutely. Well, that's actually the ability to monitor the environment is quite interesting, because as I was doing some work on the Wi-Fi part, and when you think about the ability to monitor how things go with the frequency rather than cameras, it has a huge advantage. First of all, because it might be easier to process the information, but in terms of privacy, there is an advantage. You don't have to take, video shots of the people going around. So that might be a good way to address some use cases in that area.
One thing I'd point out is both the UK, as you mentioned, and the FCC have had consultations, and we're aware of there's a fair amount of research going on in different types of technologies that can utilize these bands. So I think right now, from a regulatory perspective, the most helpful thing would be to make it easy for people to get experimental licenses to try things. And the second is to find some places where some bands can be made available on a license exempt basis, so that to allow experimentation. Just like the FCC had no idea that Wi-Fi was going to happen, right, in 2.4, right? But said, okay, we'll allow people to try this frequency hopping and this, and who knows what's going to happen. So I think there's, some of those same ideas in terms of making, some sandboxes available where people can try stuff, I think would be very valuable.
Yeah.
And the thing that's special, is unique, is the propagation isn't that much worse. You have the issue like in 60 gigahertz, you have oxygen absorption. You don't have, up, whereas like 120 or 180, it's bad again. But in between, it's actually better propagation. And so here, potentially you can have much wider bandwidth. And what can people do with that? It'd be great to find out. Let's create those sandboxes if possible.
Absolutely, and it cannot be too hard. You mentioned Wi-Fi, but initially it was like a wireline replacement. It was supposed to replace the wires in the office, and clearly there was a great underappreciation of what the technology could do. We are getting to the end of our time, so what I would like to ask you is to each of you to give some parting thoughts of how do you think that from a regulatory point of view we can encourage spectrum sharing in the millimeter wave type of frequencies. What's the best way to go here? What can we do to make spectrum sharing more widespread in this bands? Who wants to go first?
I'll throw out an idea just around the idea of being able to present different use cases, as we've talked about, and the advantages. Jameson talked about some of the being able to connect the unconnected through the use of the spectrum that's being shared currently, and there are other things like that, that as we allow more entities to access spectrum, the more use cases that are available.
Okay.
If I can add to what Mark said, that I mean, making that spectrum available for different entities, for different users, is the way that regulators want to have to utilize the spectrum efficiently, rather than keeping the millimeter wave spectrum underutilized, keeping the bands lightly licensed if that's possible, wait and see, not to decide for some of the high bands, making rush decisions to define the way of licensing. There are some maybe usage in some of the very important band, like the 26, 28 E-band, the 60 gigahertz, as Alan said. I think it should be identified and should be decided how to license these bands, and then wait and see to enable other sectors and entities to access that spectrum.
I'll go next. From Loon's point of view, we view the E-band, for example, as the everybody band, because its propagation characteristics mean that all of these existing and future services can coexist in harmony with one another. But the most important thing to do from a regulatory point of view is, as I mentioned before, to start with the data. By making available databases of links that already exist and creating frameworks that can easily accommodate additional links as they're added, whether those links are on the ground or in the air or at sea or in space, will enable not only tremendous innovation, but also coexistence well into the future. So we view database-driven light licensing in E-band moving toward a dynamic management of E-band as a future-proof way of ensuring coexistence for some of these critical public policy goals that we talked about, whether that's connecting the unconnected, whether it's providing service in the wake of a natural disaster, and many other innovations and things to come. So thank you.
Thank you. Alan.
Well, I would have two suggestions. One is, it's because scale is so important to getting wide adoption and deployment, it's really important to share best practices, communicate at different levels, so that over time we can build consensus around what is the best use of a certain band, and then try to take that same approach globally as much as possible. So events like this, having making sure that people share information and learn about it is just essential. If we end up with 10 great ways to do it in the same band differently in each market, it becomes very hard for industry to scale in some way. I can't imagine how that's going to work. So that, that becomes an essential piece. And so there's the whole learning process of first allowing experimentation, understanding what the use cases are, seeing where there's real, market interest, and then being really good about communicating and disciplined about developing the real rules.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I guess, the sort of final message is we need to keep an open mind. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but to make it happen, we need to do the best we can to learn from each other, communicate, and be willing and ready to try different things. So with that, well, thanks a lot, and I'm going to handing it over to Martha again.
Yes, thank you, Monica, and thank you to all the speakers, Alan, Jameson, Mohammed, and Mark. I really enjoyed this session. I was following all that you were saying, and it's really exciting to see all the opportunities and also all the challenges that we still have to face. So thank you very much for this. I really like the conclusions and the advices for regulators and in general for everyone to consider about the future of this band. I hope you enjoyed this session, all of you that participated today. And please share it. It will be available on demand, but also after the summit. So please feel free to share this this session and also to give us your comments after that. So keep enjoying the DSA summit, and thank you for attending today.